On the morning of July 18th, 1989, Bob Siders returned home from his night shift, expecting to find his 18-year-old daughter Shannon at home. However, as he entered their residence, he was surprised to discover that Shannon was not there. While it wasn't unusual for Shannon to come and go as she pleased, given her age, what struck Bob as odd was that Shannon's new dog had been left unattended and had made messes around the house. Typically, Shannon would have cleaned up after the dog before Bob got home from work. Initially more annoyed than worried, Bob waited for Shannon to return. However, by 2 or 3 p.m., exhaustion from his night shift set in, and he decided to rest before his next shift, planning to talk to Shannon when he woke up. Upon awakening later that evening, Bob was disturbed to find that Shannon had still not returned home, and there were no signs that she had been there while he slept. At this point, Bob's annoyance turned to genuine concern. Shannon's prolonged absence was uncharacteristic. However, in 1989, without cell phones or GPS tracking, Bob's options for locating his daughter were limited. He anxiously waited until the last possible moment before he had to leave for work, hoping Shannon would return. The following morning, July 19th, Bob returned home early, desperately hoping to find Shannon. His heart sank as he walked through the front door and saw no sign of her presence. The last time he had seen Shannon was around 10:30 p.m. on July 17th, just before he left for work. Everything had seemed normal then. He had kissed her on the head, told her he'd see her the next day, and Shannon hadn't mentioned any specific plans. Now, on July 19th, with still no sight of his daughter, Bob decided to take action. He began calling friends and family members to see if anyone had heard from Shannon. All of them reported that they hadn't. He even contacted Shannon's mother, from whom he was separated, to check if Shannon might have gone to her place, but she wasn't there either. When Bob spoke to Shannon's friends, he learned that they had met up with Shannon on the evening of July 17th, after Bob had left for work. However, when he pressed for more details about their activities and Shannon's whereabouts when she left the group, the friends were either unable or unwilling to provide clear information. This lack of clarity from Shannon's friends left Bob feeling uneasy and frustrated. Desperate for any information, Bob even called the parents of Shannon's friends, asking if they knew anything about her whereabouts. He made it clear that Shannon didn't necessarily need to come home if she needed space, but he just wanted to know that she was safe. However, none of the parents had any helpful information to offer. The final push for Bob to involve law enforcement came from Shannon's grandmother, who insisted that Shannon's disappearance was not normal, and that Bob needed to call the police. Heeding this advice, on Thursday, July 20th, Bob reported Shannon as missing to the Michigan State Police. The state police, however, referred the report to the local police in New Ego, where Bob and Shannon lived. After reviewing the facts of the case, the local police classified Shannon as a voluntary missing person. This classification frustrated Bob, who felt that the police were not taking the situation seriously enough. When the police interviewed Bob, they learned of a potential explanation for Shannon's absence that seemed innocent enough. Shannon had a serious boyfriend named Brian, who had recently taken a job in Ohio, hundreds of miles away. This information led the police to speculate that Shannon might have left voluntarily to be with Brian. Acting on this theory, the police contacted Brian. However, when they reached him, Brian informed them that Shannon was not with him and expressed immediate concern about her whereabouts. Despite Brian's insistence that Shannon wasn't with him, the police initially remained skeptical, believing that Brian might be covering for Shannon. Brian, however, didn't back down. He continued to assert that Shannon was not with him, eventually convincing the police that he was telling the truth. Nevertheless, this didn't change the police's overall stance. They remained convinced that Shannon had voluntarily gone off on some kind of adventure and simply didn't want to come home. From the police perspective, there was no evidence pointing to foul play. Bob hadn't seen any signs of a struggle at their house, and there was no blood or other indicators of violence. Because of this, the police seemed to dismiss the case, maintaining that Shannon, being 18, was allowed to disappear if she chose to do so. However, Shannon's family vehemently disagreed with this assessment. They pointed out several factors that contradicted the idea of Shannon running away. She hadn't packed a bag, she had left her beloved new dog behind, and the only things missing were her purse and the clothes she had been wearing. Moreover, Shannon had a great deal of freedom living with her father, so she had no reason to run away. The only plausible reason for her to leave would have been to be with Brian, but he had confirmed she wasn't with him and would have already arrived if she had been on her way to him. Even if the police theory of Shannon going on an adventure was correct, There was one crucial event that Shannon wouldn't have missed: calling her aunt on her birthday on July 21st. This annual ritual was something Shannon never failed to do. As July 21st came and went without a call from Shannon, her family's worry deepened. Realizing that the New Ego police were not going to be of much help, Bob took it upon himself to spread the word about Shannon's disappearance. He printed hundreds of flyers and distributed them all over town. He gave them to truck drivers at the Pepsi distribution plant where he worked in Grand Rapids. He left copies in shops, restaurants, bars, and any other place he could think of to ensure that anyone who might have information could see Shannon's picture. Despite Bob's desperate attempts to find his daughter, no substantial leads emerged. The police, while not actively investigating, did receive a few calls from people claiming to have seen Shannon around town. However, it doesn't appear that they made much effort to verify these tips, possibly viewing them as confirmation of their theory that Shannon was still out there of her own volition. Among the tips received by the police, one stood out as particularly alarming. A 15-year-old girl named Amy, who worked part-time at the police station, answered a call one day where the man on the other end of the line chillingly stated, "I just killed Shannon Siders." The caller didn't say anything else and hung up immediately after making this statement. Amy reported the call to a detective, and according to an episode of the TV show Cold Case Files titled Circle of Friends, they attempted to trace the call but were unsuccessful. The identity of the caller remained unknown, and they never called back, leaving this potentially crucial lead as yet another dead end. For weeks, Shannon's loved ones were left in limbo, with no real investigation underway and no sign of her. Then, around Labor Day weekend, a glimmer of hope emerged when a teenager found Shannon's ID near a bonfire site. This wasn't the only item discovered. The teen also found a gas card nearby with Bob's name on it. Recognizing the potential significance of these items, the teenager reported his findings to the police. When the police investigated the area where the ID and gas card were found, they also discovered a pair of jeans nearby. Importantly, this area wasn't just a random location. It was a well-known party spot for local teenagers, including Shannon and her friends. In fact, it had been a popular hangout spot for generations, even dating back to when Bob himself was a teenager. As soon as Bob learned about these discoveries, he confronted the police, insisting that this evidence clearly indicated that Shannon's disappearance was not a simple case of her running away, but that she was in real danger. However, the police still seemed reluctant to change their stance on the case. It turned out that the detectives knew something that Bob didn't. Undercover officers working in narcotics had previously heard about a girl named Shannon who was living at a local house known to them, and this Shannon was reportedly hiding from her father. When Bob came in expressing his concerns, the police, still holding on to this information, were skeptical of his fears. However, when the police actually went to investigate this lead, they discovered that the Shannon they had heard about was not the same Shannon Siders who was missing. Despite this revelation, the police inexplicably continued to cling to their theory that Shannon had run away. Frustrated with the lack of police action, Bob took matters into his own hands once again. He searched the area where Shannon's ID and gas card were found multiple times. On at least one occasion, he even enlisted the help of a friend who was a state trooper to scour the area for any sign of Shannon. Despite their efforts, these searches yielded no significant results. The only things they found were a few articles of clothing, but Bob was confident that they didn't belong to his daughter. Throughout this ordeal, Shannon's entire family was tormented by the knowledge that something was terribly wrong, while the police seemed to do nothing to even verify that she was okay. Their worst fears were tragically confirmed almost 3 months after Shannon's disappearance. On October 15th, a hunter walked into the police station to report that he had stumbled across what appeared to be human remains in the woods, the very same woods where Shannon's ID and gas card had been found. By this point, even though the police hadn't been actively investigating, they had a sinking feeling that they knew whose remains the hunter had discovered. When the police arrived at the location indicated by the hunter, they found remains that were almost completely skeletal. Due to animal activity, one of the hands was missing, and the skull was detached from the rest of the body. A pair of underwear was pulled down around one ankle, and the top appeared to have been pushed up over the chest area. The advanced state of decomposition left little that could be used to identify the body, except for the teeth, which were intact enough to compare to dental records. As feared, dental records confirmed that the remains were indeed those of Shannon Siders. The location where Shannon was found was shockingly close to where her ID and other belongings had been discovered, a mere 50 yards away. Despite the proximity, Bob and his friend had never seen her during any of their searches. Bob later explained that the terrain in the area had dips and small valleys, making it impossible to see 50 yards ahead. He also noted that he had never ventured into the wooded area during his searches, believing that if he had, he probably would have found her. In retrospect, he expressed relief that he hadn't been the one to make such a gruesome discovery. Despite the advanced state of decomposition, the medical examiner was able to determine that Shannon had been brutally attacked before her death. Her nose was broken, she had fractured ribs, and there were injuries to her fingers. The cause of death was determined to be a blow to the head with an unknown object. Although there was no biological evidence of sexual assault due to the skeletonized state of the remains, there were signs of mutilation that indicated the attack was sexually motivated. According to an article published by Fox 17 News, the medical examiner officially ruled Shannon's manner of death as homicide. It was only at this point, months after Shannon's disappearance, that the police finally opened a full investigation into her death. Given the decomposed state of Shannon's remains, it was challenging to determine exactly when she had died. To address this, investigators enlisted the help of a forensic entomologist, a scientist who studies insects. By examining the types and life stages of insect larvae found in and around Shannon's remains, the entomologist was able to estimate that Shannon likely died between mid to late July and early August. This timeline, combined with the fact that there had been no confirmed sightings of Shannon since the day she disappeared, led investigators to believe that Shannon was likely killed in the early morning hours of July 18th, shortly after she was last seen. With this information in hand, investigators turned their attention to identifying potential suspects. Since there had been no signs of a struggle at Shannon's home, their initial theory was that the murderer was likely someone close to Shannon. However, their first step in this direction would prove to be misguided. Surprisingly, the police first turned their suspicion towards Bob Siders, Shannon's father. Their reasoning stemmed from Bob's familiarity with the area where Shannon was found, and they speculated that he might have staged the attack to appear sexually motivated in order to deflect suspicion from himself. There were also rumors circulating that Bob had been overly strict with Shannon, possibly even abusive. Bob himself admitted to having slapped Shannon once when she had been disrespectful to her great-grandmother, though he acknowledged this was not acceptable behavior. News of the police's suspicion quickly spread through the small town, and Bob became aware that he was under scrutiny. Determined to clear his name and ensure that the investigation could move forward to find Shannon's real killer, Bob took the initiative to confront the police directly. He went to the station and asked outright if he was a suspect. The detective confirmed that at that point, Bob was indeed a suspect, along with everyone else connected to the case. In response, Bob volunteered to take a polygraph test to prove his innocence. He passed the test, which allowed the police to cross him off their list of suspects and move on to investigating other individuals who might have actual information about Shannon's disappearance and murder. The next person of interest was Brian, Shannon's boyfriend. However, he was quickly ruled out as a viable suspect. Given that Shannon was killed in the early morning hours of July 18th, there was no way Brian could have traveled from Ohio to Michigan, committed the murder, and then returned to Ohio in time to show up for work the next morning, which he was verified to have done. According to reporting by Heather Lynn Peters for MLive, Brian was cleared of any suspicion almost immediately. Finally, the police turned their attention to Shannon's friends, the group of people she had been with on the night she disappeared. It was during interviews with these friends that investigators finally got some details about what had actually transpired on the night of July 17th. The police learned that there were 8 people with Shannon that night. According to an episode of On the Case with Paula Zahn, it was revealed that the friends' initial reluctance to provide information wasn't as sinister as it had first appeared. They had been hesitant to talk because they feared getting into trouble for their activities that night. Shannon's friends disclosed that they had started the evening by partying, which eventually evolved into a dangerous game of car tag. They had been chasing each other in their cars, driving recklessly through the countryside. To make matters worse, they had been drinking alcohol during these activities. This revelation shed light on why they had been so tight-lipped initially. They were afraid of the consequences of their irresponsible behavior. While this explanation provided some context for their initial silence, it raised questions about why they hadn't come forward with this information sooner, especially as the search for Shannon dragged on for months. The gravity of Shannon's disappearance should have outweighed their concerns about getting into trouble for underage drinking and reckless driving. According to the friends' accounts, after they finished their game of car tag, they met up in the neighboring town of Grant and continued partying there. At some point during the night, Shannon got a ride home with two brothers she knew from high school, Paul and Matt Jones. This was the last time her friends reported seeing her. The police brought in Matt and Paul Jones for questioning. According to reporting by Joel Bissell for MLive, the brothers provided identical stories. They claimed that they had given Shannon a ride home, dropping her off between 12:30 and 1:30 a.m. on July 18th. They even described the route they took and said they saw Shannon's dog jumping in the window as they watched her walk inside the house. They maintained that this was the last time they saw her. Despite the consistency in the brothers' stories, the police were unable to corroborate their account. However, for reasons that remain unclear, after interviewing Matt and Paul, the police seemed to accept their story without pushing for further verification or investigating potential inconsistencies. As the investigation continued, it appeared to stall. After interviewing everyone who was with or saw Shannon on the night she died, leads quickly dried up. Despite Shannon's family continuing to press for justice, years began to pass with no updates on the case. As the 10-year, 15-year, and 20-year anniversaries of Shannon's murder came and went, it started to feel like all hope for solving the case was lost. However, a significant development occurred in September 2011 when a cold case task force was assembled in New Ego. The very first case they decided to look into was Shannon's. Even though the original investigation hadn't yielded any results, the work that had been done gave the new detectives something to work with. They had over 2,000 pages of reports and interviews to review. In addition to reviewing the original investigation materials, these new investigators also put together a victimology report. They wanted to know everything about who Shannon was, believing that this comprehensive understanding might provide clues about who killed her. During this process, they realized that in addition to identifying her killer, there was another significant item they should be looking for: Shannon's class ring. She had always worn it, but it wasn't on her body when she died, nor was it found at her father's house. The investigators hoped that finding the ring might lead them to the killer. However, they also considered the possibility that the ring might still be somewhere in the woods, perhaps lost during the attack and not collected with the rest of the evidence. To explore this possibility, the lead investigator took a metal detector out to the woods and meticulously scanned the area. Although he found various metal scraps, Shannon's ring was not among the items discovered. Concurrent with these efforts, the investigators decided to re-interview some of Shannon's friends. According to the episode Concurrent with These Efforts, the investigators decided to re-interview some of Shannon's friends. According to the episode of On the Case with Paula Zahn, a significant breakthrough came during an interview with one of Shannon's best friends, Julia, later that year. Julia told investigators that on the night Shannon died, she had stopped by Shannon's house around midnight to tell her about a job opportunity. While the nature of this job opportunity was never specified in the source material, what was crucial was Julia's account of that night. Julia reported that Shannon wasn't home when she first stopped by. Determined to speak with her friend, Julia didn't just leave and forget about it. Instead, she returned to Shannon's house 3 or 4 more times between midnight and 3 a.m. Each time, Julia said, Shannon didn't answer the door. At one point, Julia even went inside the house to look for Shannon but couldn't find her. This testimony directly contradicted the story provided by the Jones brothers, who had claimed they dropped Shannon off at home between 12:30 and 1:30 a.m. Julia's account made it nearly impossible for Shannon to have been at her house during the time frame the brothers had specified. If Shannon had indeed been home, it would have been highly unlikely for Julia to have missed her during her multiple visits, especially when she had gone inside the house to look for her friend. Armed with this new information that cast doubt on the Jones brothers' story, the cold case team decided it was time to take a closer look at Paul and Matt Jones. When they delved into the brothers' backgrounds, they discovered that both had been involved in serious legal troubles over the years. According to reporting by Matt Erspamer for Fox 17, both Paul and Matt had been arrested on drug charges since Shannon's murder. Matt had also been charged with domestic violence assault. Paul's record was even more concerning, as he had been arrested for multiple felony home invasions. Notably, the details of one of these home invasions suggested that the crime was sexually motivated. This information about the brothers' criminal history was compelling, but investigators knew it was circumstantial at best. They needed more than just Julia's testimony and the brothers' subsequent criminal records to build a case. They needed hard evidence before they could bring Matt and Paul in for questioning again. In an effort to gather more information, the investigators decided to harness the power of social media. They set up a Facebook page asking members of the community to come forward with any information about Shannon's case. They believed that someone out there must know something, and with the rise of social media, they hoped this approach would help them reach potential witnesses or individuals with crucial information. There was some initial concern that people might be hesitant to send in tips if they knew the page was run by the police. However, an interesting development occurred. The public largely assumed the page was being run by someone else entirely. Amy, the former 15-year-old who had answered the phone at the police station when the mysterious confession call came in years earlier. Shannon's case had deeply affected Amy, and in the intervening years, she had started investigating on her own. She had been talking to hundreds of people in the community trying to track down the killer. Her efforts were well known, so when the Facebook page appeared, most people assumed Amy was behind it. This misconception actually worked in the investigators' favor, as people might be more inclined to share information if they thought they were communicating with a civilian rather than law enforcement. The strategy proved effective, and tips began to come in. Not all of them were credible. For instance, someone came forward claiming that Shannon had been held captive in a basement and repeatedly assaulted and tortured. When investigators located the house in question, they discovered it didn't even have a basement. However, some tips proved to be helpful and strengthened the detectives' growing suspicion that Matt and Paul Jones were involved in Shannon's murder. In January 2012, a significant tip came from a former girlfriend of Paul's. She told police that she had seen a class ring in Paul's ashtray. She even remembered making a joke about it, asking if he was asking her out on a date while having another girl's class ring. According to her account, Paul had responded ominously, "Face it, she's probably dead." This information seemed to point directly to Shannon's missing class ring, but for reasons that remain unclear, it doesn't appear that investigators immediately pursued this lead further. Another crucial tip came in April from someone who knew the brothers. This individual reported overhearing Matt and Paul bragging about assaulting and killing Shannon during a house party in 1990. The tipster was only now coming forward with this information, over 2 decades after the alleged conversation took place. While the delay in reporting was puzzling, it provided another piece of the puzzle implicating the Jones brothers. Interestingly, around the same time these incriminating tips were coming in, investigators received another tip that seemed to point away from the brothers' involvement. This tipster claimed that Matt Jones had told them that on the night Shannon disappeared, she had been with a group of Mexican partygoers, insinuating with a clear tone of prejudice that this group of people had something to do with her death. The timing and nature of this tip raised suspicions among the investigators. It seemed conveniently timed, possibly an attempt to deflect attention away from the Jones brothers as other incriminating information was surfacing. This suspicion was reinforced when the investigators traced the source of the tip and discovered it came from a relative of the Joneses. As the investigation progressed, the cold case team received another intriguing tip. Someone contacted the police suggesting that there might be a letter buried with Shannon containing a confession to her murder. This tip was specific enough that investigators felt compelled to take drastic action. According to reporting by Heather Lynn Peters for MLive, the police made the decision to exhume Shannon's body. The decision to exhume a body is never taken lightly, but there was a reasonable basis for this action. When Shannon was laid to rest, her friends had asked Bob if they could write letters to her and place them in her casket as a way of saying goodbye. Bob had agreed to this request and had never read any of the letters himself. This wasn't widely publicized information, which lent credibility to the tip about a potential confession letter. On July 26, 2012, Shannon's body was exhumed. Detectives carefully sifted through all of the letters left by her friends. However, as they read the last one, they realized this tip had led to a dead end. There was no confession in any of the letters. Just when it seemed like this lead had been a waste of time and resources, the exhumation yielded an unexpected discovery. As detectives examined Shannon's remains, they noticed that she was still holding human hair in her hand. It was unclear how this hair had been missed during the original examination of her body. While it was unfortunate that this potential evidence hadn't been collected earlier, there was hope that with advancements in forensic technology, this hair might provide crucial information. The investigators collected the hair and sent it off for testing, waiting anxiously for results that might finally crack the case. However, much to their disappointment, this potential breakthrough turned into another dead end. The hair in Shannon's hand was determined to be her own. At this point, the investigators felt stuck. Their instincts were telling them that Matt and Paul Jones were responsible for Shannon's death. But besides the tips they had received, they lacked concrete evidence. The case seemed to have hit another impasse until September 2012, when a new witness came forward with a startling account. A woman named Jenny approached Amy, who had been independently investigating the case, with a wild story. Jenny claimed that she believed she had been a possible witness to Shannon's murder. While the exact details of what Jenny initially told Amy are unclear, Jenny's next step was to go to the police. She told them that if they really wanted to know what happened to Shannon, they needed to talk to a man named Dean Robinson. Dean Robinson was a name familiar to local law enforcement, but not for positive reasons. Dean had an outward hatred of the police, a sentiment that was mutual. At the time, he was serving a sentence for attempted murder. Under normal circumstances, Dean would not have been someone the police would consider a reliable source of information. However, given the stalled nature of the investigation and their desperation for new leads, the police decided to follow up on Jenny's suggestion. They went to see Dean in prison, explaining that Jenny had directed them to him regarding Shannon's case. They appealed to him, saying that while they knew there was animosity between them, Shannon deserved justice. They urged him to share anything he might have seen. Initially, Dean was extremely hesitant. Being in prison, he was acutely aware of the potential dangers of being seen as a snitch. However, with some coaxing, Dean eventually agreed to tell the police what he knew about that fateful night in 1989. According to the Cold Case Files episode, Dean, who was 19 at the time of Shannon's disappearance, provided a chilling account of the events. He told police that on the night of July 17, 1989, he had been riding around with 14-year-old Jenny near the woods where Shannon's body was later found. During their drive, they came across Paul and Matt Jones. The brothers stopped them and asked if they had seen a girl walking around, saying they were trying to find her. Dean told the police that he and Jenny hadn't seen anyone and drove off. However, later that night, they encountered the Jones brothers again. This time, it appeared as though there had been some kind of accident. Dean, wanting to help, got out of his car, but as he approached, he realized something wasn't right. According to Dean's account, Paul appeared frantic and kept looking over at someone lying on the ground. Dean couldn't immediately see who it was. As he moved closer, he stumbled and fell. It was then, while on the ground, that Dean says he saw Shannon's body. Dean described how the situation quickly turned violent. He said Paul suddenly went on the defensive, kicking him in the face. As Dean tried to get up, he saw Matt coming toward him with a hammer. The situation could have escalated further, but Jenny, who was still in the car, started honking the horn. When the brothers realized someone else was present, they backed off. Dean managed to get back to his car and quickly drove away with Jenny. Once they were a safe distance away, Dean told Jenny that the men were probably trying to help the girl and would likely take her to a hospital. He then swore Jenny to silence about what they had witnessed. This account from Dean provided investigators with not one but two potential eyewitnesses who claimed to have seen Matt and Paul Jones with Shannon's lifeless body. It was a significant breakthrough in the case. However, the investigators didn't immediately move to arrest the Jones brothers based on this new information. Instead, they took their time, methodically building their case against Matt and Paul. They continued to gather and analyze evidence, interview witnesses, and piece together the events of that night in July 1989. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity to Shannon's family and friends, the police arrested both Matt and Paul Jones for the murder of Shannon Siders in June 2014, nearly 25 years after her death. The brothers denied any involvement in Shannon's death throughout their arrest and subsequent legal proceedings. Their trial began on April 20th, 2015. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the testimonies that had been gathered over the years, particularly the eyewitness accounts provided by Dean and Jenny. The defense, on the other hand, pointed to the lack of physical evidence linking the brothers to the crime and questioned the credibility of the witnesses, especially Dean, citing his criminal history. After several weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned two separate verdicts on May 8, 2015. Matt Jones was found guilty of first-degree murder, while Paul Jones was convicted of second-degree murder. Matt was subsequently sentenced to life in prison, while Paul received a sentence of 30 to 75 years. Both brothers attempted to appeal their convictions, but the appellate court upheld the original decisions, and they remained incarcerated. It seemed that justice had finally been served for Shannon Siders, albeit after a long and winding road spanning over 2.5 decades. However, the story didn't end there. Sometime after the trial, Dean Robinson recanted his eyewitness testimony in its entirety. In a sworn affidavit to a private investigator named Bill Proctor, Dean claimed that his testimony had been fed to him by the police and that he had committed perjury when he took the stand in 2015. He now stated that he had never been injured by Matt or Paul Jones in his life. This recantation threw the case into a new light. While Jenny continued to stand by her story, Dean's reversal raised questions about the validity of the convictions. Bill Proctor, the private investigator to whom Dean gave his affidavit, made it his mission to prove the Jones brothers' innocence. He created a website called Who Killed Shannon Siders, featuring over 20 videos outlining how he believed the case had gone from cold to a wrongful conviction. The situation became increasingly complex. Murder cases with no physical evidence are inherently messy, and wrongful convictions do occur more often than many would like to admit. However, it's important to note that the case against the Jones brothers didn't rely solely on Dean's testimony. There were several other witnesses who either saw the brothers or heard them say incriminating things over the years. Moreover, the brothers' original story about dropping Shannon off at home between 12:30 and 1:30 a.m. on July 18th remained a significant point of contention. For their claim of innocence to be true, something would have had to happen to Shannon after she walked into her home, with her father at work and her friend Julia repeatedly stopping by shortly after. While not impossible, this scenario seemed highly improbable. The alternative theories put forward by the private investigator were lengthy and complex. One of the main takeaways from his investigation was that almost no one involved in the case, suspect or witness, had an entirely clean record or unimpeachable reliability. This fact made discerning the truth in a case with no physical evidence even more challenging, as it relied heavily on human testimony, with all its inherent flaws and inconsistencies. As of the time of this retelling, Shannon's family remains confident that the right people are in prison for her murder. There is no denying that Paul and Matt Jones were the last two people confirmed to have seen Shannon alive, and their subsequent criminal records suggest they were capable of committing such a crime. Paul and Matt Jones continue to be incarcerated, maintaining their innocence with the support of Bill Proctor. The case remains a topic of debate and investigation, with the possibility that new evidence or testimonies could emerge in the future to change what is currently accepted as fact. Regardless of the ongoing controversies and uncertainties surrounding the case, one undeniable truth remains. Shannon Siders died a horrible and terrifying death. She was a young woman with her whole life ahead of her, and that life was brutally cut short. Shannon deserves justice, and for everyone involved, her family, her friends, and the community that was shaken by her murder, there is hope that true justice has been served. The case of Shannon Siders serves as a stark reminder of the complexities involved in solving cold cases, especially those with limited physical evidence. It highlights the challenges faced by law enforcement in balancing the pursuit of justice with ensuring that the right individuals are held accountable. It also underscores the lasting impact that such crimes have on families and communities, and the importance of continued efforts to solve these cases, even decades after they occur. As technology advances and investigative techniques evolve, there is always the possibility that new evidence could come to light, potentially providing definitive answers in cases like Shannon's. Until then, her story remains a tragic testament to the enduring nature of the search for truth and justice in the face of heinous crimes.